There's never been a better time for a company to be delivering social value.
Mark Shearer is a Westminster councillor and founder of ActionFunder, a social enterprise connecting businesses with community projects.
He has a unique insight into the challenges and opportunities within the built environment.
Do you want to talk a little bit around some of the challenges of how the current system works?
It's a really inefficient space. 46% of grants cost more to distribute than they're worth. There's 8 billion of unspent Section 106 and SIL in UK local authorities. It's eye-watering. There are more and more and more regulations and checks. How can we strip out uncertainty? How can we create more pragmatism around the decision making? How can we increase transparency? And how can we work with businesses to come back into Westminster? The economy in St James is larger than Namibia, Jamaica, Bosnia Herzegovina. It's huge. If you look at the level of ambition for the buildings in central London, they're just nowhere near where they used to be.
I agree.
It's the community voice that is critical.
Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. And so there's two main roles, I suppose, that we want to talk about. Your role as a councillor in Westminster and your role as the founder of ActionFunder. And to start, I'd like to ask, there's a sort of clear line between these two, which is about public service. Do you remember the moment where in your background, which was in the kind of private sector, you went, public service is where my career needs to go?
Ooh, we're starting off with a big one. There wasn't a defined moment. I think I've been born with it, actually. I was one of those kids who apparently as a toddler, if I was walking down the street and saw a homeless person, I would go over, I'd be worried about them, I would chat to them, I'd make sure that we bought them some food. So I think naturally I had an amazing childhood, and I think I've always naturally wanted to leave the world a slightly better place. Mm-hmm. And my very best mate died when I was 15, quite unexpectedly. And I think that also made me realize you have one life to do what you really, really want to do. Mm-hmm. So my background is actually I'm a chartered surveyor. I have a small commercial investment company that owns some assets in London. But having that gave me the springboard to do what I really wanted to do with my life, which is public service. And I started doing it privately, set up ActionFunder. The precursor to that was a community consultancy delivering community campaigns for major corporates. So we did Made Local for Molson Coors, a big national campaign for them. We delivered a campaign called Outdoor Classroom Day for Unilever, for Persil. That's engaged 13.5 million children around the world in 180 countries. But we just noticed there was a real gap in the marketplace. There was no business to community funding platform. So ActionFunder was created with the backing of Sir Robert McAlpine, the big construction firm, for them to use it, but also for anyone else. So ActionFunder came first, really. And then the ex-leader of Westminster Council, it was actually a planning matter on our block of flats in Pimlico. And I was having a bit of a nightmare with the officer. And I phoned up. I said, well, look, you can't reject this. I mean, why are you rejecting? He said, well, look, if you've got a problem with that, speak to your local councillor. I said, well, I have no idea who that is. So I said, well, you can look them up online. So I looked them up, spoke to Nikki Aitken. And if anyone's met Nikki, she gets stuff done. And so we overturned the decision within 24 hours. And she said, oh, you have an interesting profile. Ever thought about politics? And I was like, no, Nikki, I'm an awful poker player and I cry in cartoons. So I'm going to be a bad politician. Anyway, she convinced me. And so I'm the councillor for Westminster. I'm a councillor at Westminster for St James's Ward. And I'm chief whip for the Conservative group. And that public service through ActionFunder and through the council is it's a real honour and a privilege and something that I absolutely love doing.
So how has ActionFunder changed? You mentioned that you were talking about getting money from businesses into communities, but now I suppose you're combining that with your background in sort of property and using money that works its way around the planning system and hopefully better distributing it.
My background being property, it sounds like I designed this properly, but I have a kind of a background in place. We serve people through ActionFunder, and obviously I have the political insight and role. But for me, property is a lot of the glue that pulls that together.
Mm-hmm.
And what you'll see is, so ActionFunder, it's a community grant management system. And we enable funders, that's companies, local authorities, foundations, philanthropists. We enable them to effectively find the best local community projects and fund them through the system and track all the updates. And so very much, we realized that there were lots of peer-to-peer funding networks, Just Giving, GoFundMe, etc. There were lots of business-to-business funding networks, but no business-to-community. So we thought if we can create a really transparent, efficient funding platform for the business-to-community side, then that could serve places and communities really well. And that naturally aligns itself with the built environment and with developers and planners and so on. So ActionFunder has 50 clients or funders, some of the biggest corporates, names in the UK. And we enable them to find, fund and follow the best local community projects. And invariably, there are probably about 30, 35 of those funders, those companies are built environment based.
And I think we've been at some events recently together where you've pulled out some amazing stats about SIL and 106 and actually how in the UK grant money costs almost as much to distribute as it does to collect, which boggles my mind. Or, you can spend as much on distributing the money as you've raised, basically. Do you want to talk a little bit around some of the challenges of how the current system works, and then how ActionFunder assists?
Yeah, sure. So there's never been a better time for a company to be delivering social value. Because now, if you want to deliver business value, you want to grow your business, you want to get planning permission, you want to engage your employees and local communities, this is the time to do it. And the reason why is because local authorities are really struggling to deliver their services financially, and they're now looking for the private sector to contribute. And the Social Value Act and the Procurement Act are very much driving that. So at least 10% of contract value now, if you are delivering to the public sector, needs to be delivered as social value. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a really important timing bit here, that the reason why we're doing this is because now is the time when delivering social value as a company will not only deliver impact, but also a lot of commercial value. The second thing that you were alluding to is it's a really inefficient space, and there are lots of problems with it. So the old model was that it was a kind of an add-on. It was kind of the chairman's wife chose a charity and off you go. Mm-hmm. Now things have evolved since there, but some of the processes haven't. And yes, there was some research done by a platform called Plinth, who are kind of in the same space. 46% of grants cost more to distribute than they're worth.
That's which just bizarre, isn't it?
It's bonkers. It's bonkers. But once you take into account all the admin, the costs, and so on, then you are starting to realise that actually the grants need to be quite large to be able to do all the due diligence and the admin around it. Now, if you look at the National Lottery, they typically say that their cost of giving is around 7 to 8%, and they're obviously one of the most competitive in the UK because their scale and their economies of scale. But they also, I believe, report that for every lottery ticket bought, 22 pence of that is spent out of every pound is spent on running the system. So
those two stats don't seem to align, but
I think it depends what's in and what's out.
Right. Okay.
But the point is that traditionally grant giving is a very management intensive manual process. And this is why, so if you look at things like the apprenticeship levy, there's billions stuck in bank accounts or in companies around the UK because distributing it within that assurance and governance wrapper that you need is not easy. And the same goes with Section 106 and SIL. So there's 8 billion, according to the Home Builders Federation, there's 8 billion of unspent Section 106 and SIL in UK local authorities. It's eye-watering. The issue is that planning teams in local authorities are under immense strain because there are more and more and more regulations and checks that they need to administer prior to approving or rejecting planning. And so you're dealing with a bigger volume with more work. So the planners and the teams in local authorities simply don't have the bandwidth to do that and some of the mechanisms around it.
Well, and then distribute. I mean, it's never within their remit to be the ones to distribute it, but they collect it and it goes into the local authority, but then the local authority doesn't have sufficient resources to then
Correct.
distribute.
And I think what you're seeing here is natural inefficiencies in the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
You know, can you imagine if companies had that kind of money sitting on their balance sheet? I mean, they'd use it. But I think it's also because grant giving has traditionally been actually quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I think thirdly, you look at local authorities, they're set up to deliver specific things. So, you know, highways, adult social care, infrastructure projects, social housing, etc. And yet, probably a lot of the agreements in Section 106 and the NSIL, the neighbourhood SIL pots, the councils don't really cover a lot of what's been agreed to be delivered for local benefit. So they kind of get stuck. We're like, right, we're going to agree that you do this money's earmarked for all this local stuff, but as a council, they don't have that delivery mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also then procurement via public sector traditionally in the UK not particularly efficient at procuring it. So even if they do have lots of money, they will often then spend lots of money delivering things that the private sector could probably deliver in a more efficient way. I think you gave a good anecdote yesterday about an A road. Was that you? Maybe it wasn't you. Sorry, I'll take that out.
Maybe not.
A road in Bradford that was going to take 30 years to build it.
Really?
Yeah, versus like, you know, how long
I had to leave early yesterday because I had that
actually.
curveball come in during the meeting. But yeah, and I think that. But what's really unfair is that, putting my political hat on, as a councillor, there are no votes in planning.
Yeah, I
can't think in the last 7 years as a councillor when somebody's picked up the phone and said, "Oh, we massively support. Yeah, we're a big collective group of people. We massively support this development."
Yeah.
Can you lobby as our local councillor to support this scheme? It's always been the opposite.
Yeah.
So, but it's unfair because the schemes that are being developed are delivering huge sums of money for public benefit,
mm-hmm.
but the money is going to the local authorities and they're not spending it. So the community don't realise the community benefits that should be coming their way. And it's not the developer's fault the money's not being distributed, it's the local authorities.
What's the best way to do it? What would be a different way to do it? Well, sorry, I don't want to put ActionFunder out of business, but it feels like
we're doing that. We're already doing that.
If you just left the money with the private sector and made them spend it, they'd probably spend it more efficiently.
We're already, as ActionFunder, distributing, or I say we aren't. We're providing the platform, and Greenwich are distributing their £1 million NSIL pot through ActionFunder, and it's great. And they're doing it because they want more transparency. Mm-hmm. They want to distribute the money more effectively and efficiently, but they also want the public participation bit, so people can vote and get involved in where the money goes, and that's really important. But actually, probably the biggest driver, apart from the efficiency one, is that our platform tracks in real time all the outcomes and the updates from the funded projects. So it's going to give the politicians the evidence, say, that's exactly where that £1 million has gone.
Yep.
And if you want to break it down, we can show you where each project that's been funded, who it's benefiting, the amount of money they've got, the outcome they've generated, and the timelines.
And does it tell you what the development was that paid for it?
Yeah. No, sorry, it doesn't. Not in this case. But I've been speaking with other local authorities and saying, look, going back to what I was saying, councils are set up to deliver certain services and not others. And distributing money to local communities is not something they're great at doing, the majority of them. So I've been saying to other major London councils, why don't you let the developers retain the NSIL, the neighbourhood SIL pot, and distribute it through ActionFunder. They're responsible for distributing it, but with total oversight from the officers. And we've started to see that kind of mechanism happening. But it's very nascent. And if there's one thing, if people are watching this podcast, I want them to be able to look at the Section 106 and SIL problem in a different way, and to be thinking, well, actually, if we use technology, maybe there is the opportunity for developers to take on this responsibility, to distribute that money, create the public benefit, involve the councillors and the council in that decision making, but make sure there's not this logjam.
I think there's two interesting points that raises. The first of which is that I don't think there's sufficient trust in developers to do that. Right, I reckon.
Without the right...
But weirdly, if they were to be able to do it with the right oversight and the right mechanisms in place, they might start to gain the public's trust back.
Correct.
Because what developer wouldn't want to be seen to be refurbishing the library, whatever, upgrading the boilers of the local swimming pool? Of course, most house builders would love that, and they sort of are, but in a very non-transparent way that is sort of inefficient and sometimes doesn't happen. So, I mean... It would help build trust. And it comes back to this point that I think keeps coming up, which is that the development industry has not done a sufficiently good job of telling people what a great job it does. There's lots of bash the developer vibes. Successive governments have had that. There's not, the industry itself doesn't stand up and go, look, we contribute twice as much as financial services to the UK GDP, but we also put people in houses. Bankers don't. They just provide financial services, whereas we're actually building stuff and employing people and generating GDP growth for the UK, and then also providing lots of public services, which you can now see more clearly. But I do think it's important that the developers get to be the ones to deliver the public good, not just write the check.
So, again, putting my Westminster councillor hat on, we get lobbied the whole time. I represent St James's Ward, which is, if you draw a line from the Royal Courts of Justice to Hyde Park Corner to Victoria Station to Lambeth Bridge, it's that whole area. Mm-hmm. The economy in St James is larger than Namibia, Jamaica, Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's huge. So there are a lot of planning applications and there's a lot of value to be created. We get lobbied the whole time. And I keep saying to people lobbying me, the day that I was elected as a councillor, actually the next day, because you're normally elected at around about 4 a.m. and you don't know what's going on during the count. But the day after that, you have to go and see the chief exec of the council, and you have to sign a letter that confirms your appointment. And the letter basically says you will serve and represent your communities and the residents that have elected you in. That is your role as a councillor. So if a developer is coming to lobby me as a councillor, quite frankly, they can say whatever they want, but actually they need to get the community on side, because I'm there to represent the local residents of the community. Now, obviously, if something doesn't stack up, or maybe the development's great, but the community don't understand that, I'm also there to facilitate. Okay. Now, this is important because I think the development sector needs to, there's a greater opportunity if they engage directly with communities, rather than just thinking that the councillors and the council are the gatekeepers to planning. Yes, they are. They're the decision makers. But actually, it's the community voice that is critical. So going back to it, I think that it's incredibly important that developers are allowed to build that direct relationship with the community, and in the right way, in a pragmatic way. And so that's been difficult to do. But if you have the right technology, and if you have the right technology and the right transparency, then of course you can do it. And that's how we built ActionFunder. So there's total transparency. And therefore, the council can turn around and say to the developer, yep, you distribute this element of your Section 106 and NSIL. We would like final sign-off. We'd like the councillors to engage in the process and the community, but actually with the right technology, the visibility is there, and we're happy for you to do that.
What happens if they don't?
What, the developers don't distribute the money? Well, you'd have to tie it up into a legal agreement.
Yeah.
So they are obliged to. But if they don't, then I think that developer would be lucky to get any more planning permissions in that council. The really interesting area, though, is where there's unspent funds from planning levies gains, and the funds are now over their expiry date. So legally, the developers can claw back or ask back for those funds. Yeah. And I was on the phone earlier this morning with the COO of one of the biggest house builders in London. And he said it's a really difficult position because you're owed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds legally, because the councils haven't spent the money. That time period is expired. So you could take it back. And actually what we're seeing is that ActionFunder is seen as a middle ground, whereby the companies are not taking the money back onto the balance sheet. They're actually putting it onto our platform and distributing it themselves. So that's another really interesting area.
So do you want to talk a little bit about your role as a councillor as well? I mean, I suppose it's come up already, but you have a unique perspective in this. I'm an architect, and this is a podcast about the urban realm. And we've always found, and the reason that we spend a lot of time doing political engagement is that any scheme in London becomes political very quickly. Yeah. And you must see that from your role as a councillor and also somebody in the built environment. What is the most surprising thing that you've learned about the built environment from being a councillor, from the perspective of the politician?
I think it's a really good question. You know pretty early on which schemes are going to resonate with the local public and which aren't. To the extent where where actually there's going to be a scheme recommended for refusal, but you can feel that there's a positive sentiment behind it. So something like this, the Savile Row police station. That was pretty brave of the developers to basically say, actually, we're going to take. It's recommended for refusal. We're going to take this to committee anyway, and speak directly to the committee. So I think.
And did they get that overturned?
Yeah. Yes, they did. Yeah. So I think that the planning system isn't necessarily as the smokes and mirrors that people think. It's actually much more straightforward. I think the early stage sniff test of is this scheme viable, realistic? Is it commensurate with the local community? Is actually, pretty early on. The second thing is the amount of information. So I sat in the major planning committee for about 3 or 4 years. I took myself off as chief whip, but the amount of information that councillors are being asked to digest. I mean, you get packs like this every time before. And I think the last thing I'll say is that it tends to be a bit of a compromise. And this for me is a bit of a concern. So what you'll tend to have is a developer will go in with an application and they'll make it a bit bigger than they think, because they think it's going to be scaled back. Okay.
I disagree with that. Having done lots of this over the years, I think that's a misnomer. You might at the pre-app, by the time you're at the application stage, it's a total ball ache to try and change anything. So, bringing something down in height during the determination period is not on anybody's wish list.
No, I think at the pre-app stages I'm talking about.
Yeah, okay, fine, sorry.
So we see, what you end up is you end up seeing a kind of compromise. But the biggest concern I have at the moment around planning is that obviously viability is a massive issue. And if you look at the level of ambition for the buildings in central London, they're just nowhere near where they used to be. Obviously people have got one eye on cost, but we're not creating absolutely world-class design-led buildings necessarily in the way that we were 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I agree.
And I think this is a real problem. And I've heard, your design officers fed this back. I sat on the committee Berger House in Berkeley Square, and I remember saying at the committee, why is this building's fine? It's a bit big, has to be, because if it's a knockdown and rebuild, scale and massing, but it's pretty vanilla, And I got a phone call afterwards from the applicant. It got approved, saying, "Well, your design. You should see the original designs. Your design officers pulled this back." So, one of my biggest concerns about planning at the moment is the lack of ambition to be very creative and build really extraordinary buildings especially in trophy locations.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think there's anything to do with planning per se. It's like
it carries more. If you're going
actually,
into,
I'll take that back. I think it does. It involves planning, because planning is where the taxation is happening. That application of SIL and Section 106 from a time long ago, from 2016 when these rates were set, when there was more money in the system, they need to be adjusted down now. That's what the planning system could do if it wanted to improve the quality of buildings being brought forward. Because of that taxation, everything is pared down and everything has to stack. And there's no room for like a cantilever or no financial room for anything that isn't the standardist way of building. The Building Safety Act doesn't then help that, because it reinforces the idea that like standardization is better than deviation.
Yep, but I also think that so the best thing you can give in the planning system for developers is a degree of certainty.
Yes.
Okay. So you look at something like the Londoner Hotel, which I rode past today and got caught up in the Line of Duty filming scene, which is quite amusing.
Yeah, I just read that was coming back.
Yeah. So I was like, what's going on here? I'm kind of being surrounded by cops and cameras and realised what was going on. So now, whether you like it or not, it's an ambitious building. Okay. But actually, that was the second design, because the first design was basically told, no, go packing and then you got Communications House opposite with the beautiful roof. Now, it was a previous era where the planning system was more autocratic in Westminster, but I believe the developers were given more scope to be more creative and ambitious, because they knew within the process that actually that was going to be applauded and celebrated. Now, on a planning committee, you carry more of a risk creating a building that's less conventional, and it can attract more objections locally.
I know, and these things are cyclical. Once there's a bit more liquidity back in the system, then hopefully the briefs become more ambitious and the planning system learns to deal with that. It's one forces the other. We are living in a time where risk is you want to minimize the amount of risk you're taking on all decisions in that planning process. Yeah,
I think, and it depends. I'm talking about the kind of trophy assets, the big central London trophy assets where you've got the sovereign wealth funds behind it and so on. I mean, obviously the kind of the tier down from that, viability is a problem.
Okay, so you think even when money is no object, the design is still going for the safer end of the spectrum because of the planning system?
Yes, I do. And I think because ultimately the floor space that's being created, the location and the floor space and the quality of the floor space is being, that's where the value comes. So if you put a different design or a different facade on it, than you could do if you're more, you're maybe adding more risk to the system. So I think that from a councillor perspective, I would encourage architects and developers to maybe be, especially for the bigger, more trophy location, be more ambitious. And if they're getting pulled back by the officers, engage the councillors and say, look, we're trying to do something really special here. Once in a generation location, but we're being told no because it doesn't retain this, that, and so on. Well,
okay, so last question. Westminster is obviously one of the local authorities that's flipped colours.
Yeah.
So presumably when you were a councillor first, the Tories were controlled.
Yep.
And now they don't. And then they might again in the future. What does this mean? You talk about giving developers certainty, but presumably, unless you're very unified between the two parties in that local context, every 5 or 4 years, you're having to approach different people with different sales pitches if you're the developer. That must in itself create some uncertainty.
Yeah, yes.
How do you manage that as a councillor?
So Westminster was Conservative for decades. And the Conservative group was voted out in 2022 by 70 to 80 votes actually overall. And it was quite there are a couple of issues, but I think the main one was there was a big anti-Conservative. A lot of the Conservative votes stayed at home because they were anti Boris post Partygate and so on. And by the way, the politicians work much more closely cross-party than people think, And as chief whip, I'm always engaging and working with the Labour Party, and I think that's the way politics should be. I think.
Yeah, and I think that's the answer that you want, right? Like
Yeah.
If you're a developer.
I mean, there's some people who get in it because they're overtly political, but actually local politics is way more pragmatic than people realise, and I'm a big advocate of that. When Labour came in, you've got the cabinet member for the built environment, Jeff Barraclough. I was on the M&S committee on Oxford Street, the famous decision that kind of got approved and then got called in and then got refused and then got appealed and so on.
I think it's back on again now, isn't it?
It is back on. Anyway, Jeff was the only person who voted against that scheme, I believe, at committee on grounds of environmentalism, kind of a new build versus retrofit. And so when Labour came in, it was no surprise that his big direction was, hold on a minute, we're going to... They called it retrofit first as a policy, but it almost became retrofit only. And so in terms of your question, the developers having to change to political mood, I think the biggest thing that the developers in Westminster have seen is, I believe, more scrutiny around sustainability. And there have been a lot of questions around that, because you've got sustainability officers arguing with some major sustainability agencies, and it's like, well, who's right? And often the agencies have more experienced, employees and so on. But the big thing was retrofit first or only. Now, there's been the major application numbers have dried up. And we've heard that a lot of developers were thinking, right, we'll go to Camden and the city and so on. So the market will react to the way the politicians are behaving, firstly. But let's see what happens in May. It's quite ironic because we've got the opposite. We've got a very unpopular, the most unpopular national government in history. We have a very unpopular mayor who's unpopular in Westminster because of crime, and also because of street level crime, but also because of Oxford Street and the way that's been handled. There's real resentment around that. So we've got the May elections coming up. So it's a very, very different setup. And the message is incredibly clear from Paul Swaddle, who's our group leader, is that if we do win, Westminster is open for business. And clearly he and the senior team will look at how can we strip out uncertainty, how can we create more pragmatism around the decision making, how can we increase transparency, and how can we work with businesses to come back into Westminster. And I think nothing's been agreed yet, but you look at I think the retrofit first policy will likely be watered down, and I think
the City of London one is very good.
Yeah,
I think there's a pragmatism to it, and there's a process to it, and I think the Westminster one is slightly more tricky.
Yeah, and we're not no one's saying at Westminster that CO2, climate change, and environmentalism isn't important. It's critical, but should it be a determining factor? Should you be trying to force developers to refurbished end-of-life buildings simply because of an ideological principle, or should you take each building on its own merit? And we will certainly be on the second route. Yeah.
Well, on that note, on that pitch, thank you so much for coming in, Mark. It's a real pleasure.
Pleasure, Ollie. Thanks for having me.